can stop me whenever you want. Because I only really know the first
Now
little...
would be good.
Okay. Welcome to Shadow and Light, a film podcast with Molly and Sarah. I'm Molly.
And I'm Sarah.
And it is DelTober, week 2 of DelTober. Very exciting. Today we are talking about one of, I think, his most influential films to date.
Yes.
Pan's Labyrinth.
Yeah. I remember when it won a ton of awards, at least from my recollection. And it got a lot of attention, I think, because it was so unique and it did so much. I think at the time I was sort of too young for it. Was it 2006 it came out?
Yes.
So I think I wasn't really at an age where I was kind of up for that kind of thing. Because it is a very tough film. I rewatched a lot of it today and I'm reminded of how brutal it is.
I mean, I saw the film for the first time when I was in college because I knew, I think in 2006, that this was a movie that came out. Because I remember going to the local library and seeing it as one of the ones you could rent. And I was sort of like, it's, 13-year-old Molly was like, it's in Spanish. I don't want to deal with foreign film.
Right.
But I had some friends in college who said, no, you absolutely need to watch this movie. And so we sat in this darkened dorm room. And, like, the way the dorm room was set up is there was, like, a loft bed and then a couch underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
And just this TV. So we sat there and... instantly, I mean, I can just remember the night I watched it so vividly. I remember my experience of watching it so vividly.
Mm-hmm.
And just the impact it's had on me. I mean, it's for sure on my top film list of all time. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say it's like, oh, it's in the top 5 or top 10 or anything like that, just because there's a lot of movies I like. But this movie has always been a favorite of mine. Mm-hmm. Just because of Guillermo del Toro's incredible directing style and the story itself. And, I mean, we're going to dive into it, so...
He's such a visionary. And this film is, again, not, I mean, as you said, I mean, not one of my personal favorites. I wouldn't put it on, like, a top 10 list or anything. But it's a film that really gets under the skin. And I think that's kind of Guillermo's point a lot of the times, is he's not doing anything that's specifically comfortable. Right. I mean, you're watching this and you are, if you're not disturbed, then you're not paying attention. So I think it's one of those films that's meant to get you to think.
Mm-hmm. It's not an easy film by any stretch of the imagination.
Not really.
So, do we want to just kind of go over the premise quick before we start talking about it?
Yes. Yeah, let's do that. It's hard to summarize this film.
That is true.
I've been kind of like looking at recaps of it, because even as I watch it, I kind of forget the sequence of events. But basically, it's a look at how the real world blends in with the fairy tale world. Right.
There's a young girl named Ophelia who, this is during the time of the Spanish Civil War, before World War II.
1944, I think, is the year that it's actually taking place.
Oh, never mind. So maybe it is during World War II.
Yeah, but it's still when times are rough.
Yeah, times are rough. I mean, the things, the atrocities happening in connection with World War II, there's bad stuff in the world. And she... and her mother go to live with her stepfather, who's this Captain Vidal, who's like the captain of the government trying to overthrow the rebels, make sure none of these insurrections work, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's not a happy family by any stretch of the imagination. Nope. Her mom is pregnant, and Ophelia is feeling sort of definitely out of place, and she's sort of pushed to the side, because she's not the biological child of this Captain Vidal.
He's one of those guys that, I have to have a son, and, assumes that the child is a son, which eventually it is, but...
Yeah, and so she discovers this overgrown sort of labyrinth near where they're living, and she encounters this Fawn who presents her with a storybook and basically tells her that, no, you're actually this princess that we've been waiting for, and in order to rejoin your true family and find the kingdom and return to the kingdom, you have to do these series of tasks, and so... she does that, and she encounters several different monsters and creatures that are terrifying. And at the end of the film, her mom's child has been born. It is a son, I believe.
Yes. And
so she takes the kid and runs because she doesn't want it to turn into Vidal, and because the Fawn says, bring the child to me.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a Abraham and Isaac situation where the Fawn sort of, or a reverse of that. I don't know. I'm not sure. Or it's
Bible
like a reverse
stories
Cain, and maybe more like Cain and the... there isn't really a great, I guess, parallel. But basically, the Fawn says, we sacrifice your brother, and this is the last step. And she's like, no, I'm not going to.
The blood of the innocent unlocks this door to the underworld, and she's like, nope, I don't think so. And so,
and then Vidal comes and
takes the child,
and shoots her.
Yeah,
and so she dies. Spoilers if you haven't seen. I mean, the movie's 13 years old, and the opening frames of the movie show her dying body. So you know it's coming. And she passes, and then that turns out that was the test, you know, and since she passed the test, she didn't spill any other innocent blood. You know, she gets to take her place as a princess, and blah, blah, blah. And Vidal is killed by the rebels.
Thank God.
Yeah. And so the entire film, like Sarah said, there's sort of this parallel between what's happening in her magical sort of fairy tale adventure and what's happening with Vidal and what he's trying to do in terms of taking down the insurrectionists. And it's a Guillermo del Toro film, so it's violent.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, too, about the fairy tale thing, because we just rewatched the trailer to kind of get ourselves in the mood for this. And I have watched, you know, parts of this film today, rewatched them. I love the fairy tale aspect and how, you know, the mother is sort of dismissive of, oh, you're too old to read fairy tales, and yet she's got this book that she treasures greatly. And I love how Guillermo uses fairy tales as a way of not just escape, but a way of understanding problems. And it's very Tolkien-esque, I think, in a way, and the importance of fairy tales in life and to teach stories.
Yeah. And so, in preparation, you know, as I do for all of our...
You've got pages of notes.
I have pages of notes, and it's not even as much as I would have liked, but there's a few different things that talk specifically about the fairy tale. There's a YouTube channel called The Nerd Writer, and he came out with a video called Pan's Labyrinth, The Disobedient Fairy Tale, and it talks about how this story, and by using fairy tales in this way, Guillermo del Toro is purposely going against the Disney ideal, where Walt Disney, you know, he couldn't copyright those specific stories, but he could copyright his versions of them, so the Disney version is kind of the universal standard.
Yeah.
Whereas in Pan's Labyrinth, Guillermo del Toro purposely draws from a bunch of different places to kind of complicate meaning and make it so that at the end, you know, for Del Toro, he has said that he believes that the movie ends and it's 100% the fairy tale is true. She is this princess, but it still leaves it open enough that you can look at it and not really know for sure or not believe that it actually happened.
Yeah. It's less explicit than his other films, where there's a clear kind of, this happens and you know what happens. There's leaving that window open, I think, is really important too, because he doesn't like to give any guarantees. And in that way, that's what keeps you as a viewer watching and learning from what he's written and created, I think.
Right. And happy endings in Guillermo del Toro's movies are never easy. No, but they come.
They're eucatastrophe, as they say.
Yeah. But that's something that he still, I think, believes in. And I've been diving down a lot of Guillermo del Toro rabbit holes on YouTube, and one of the things, and I think we mentioned it last time, is he says there's two forces in the universe: there's love and there's hate, and he believes in love, and you can see that as in all of these films, because the end result of all of these films is sort of in that. And talking about fairy tales specifically, there's a Directors Guild of America interview that he kind of talks about. This idea of the fantastic is real and of fairy tales being so close to life, he really credits to his Mexican culture. Yeah. And Mexico sort of accepting the fantastic is ordinary. And he tells sort of this anecdote, like, if you were to go to a dinner and say, oh, my dead grandmother appeared and talked to me yesterday, like in America, people would be like, are you okay? You need to leave. Like, there's a hospital. Yeah. I said that in Mexico, and they're like, oh, yeah, well, my uncle, like, you know, he visited my aunt the other day. And it's just sort of this... There's this blurring of what it, like, the magical is a reality there, and that's something that he kind of wanted to have in his films. So, I guess sort of diving in, because, like we said, it's kind of a hard film to... You can do the plot events of the film if you really want to, but in the interest, I think, just of time and just of talking the larger themes, because with Crimson Peak... Clearly, our episode last week was so long.
It took me 2 or 3 hours to edit that down to an hour.
And there was 10 minutes worth of stuff we had to cut. So I think, at least. I mean, if you haven't seen these Guillermo del Toro movies, you should. And you should know going into it just how much you can possibly talk about. But I think maybe just sticking to the themes for now, especially... And that was one of the things he himself says, is that in that Directors Guild interview, is like, to him, plot is the least interesting thing. It's the what, it's the who, it's the how that he likes to focus on. So... a lot of the research I have is from different YouTube videos. There's a lot of great video essays about Pan's Labyrinth that are out there. So the disobedient fairy tale, there's that disobedient fairy tale video, it's interesting. There was also an article I did not have time to read called Desire and Disobedience in Pan's Labyrinth. And so that the idea of disobedience and art is something that's really tied in here. And in that Directors Guild America, he says the only way to find yourself is to disobey. And I think that is very clearly seen in Pan's Labyrinth.
Yeah, as with all his other films, that he definitely kind of deviates from any kind of norm.
Yes. For him, it says disobedience is the beginning of thought. And so Ophelia is disobedient in that she's still, pursuing these fairy tales.
Absolutely.
But also disobeys the fairy tales, too. And that's how the story happens, and that's how she ends up in the place where she's
and her final choice of disobeying that sort of, direction of, you have to shed the blood of the innocent, a.k.a. your brother. She's like, no, that's not going to happen. And that final disobedience is actually kind of the final test that actually gets her into that underworld.
Right. Yeah. And so it's so interesting that the heroine, has to disobey, and that's how she... Because that is usually, a big thing in fairy tales is that you disobey, something bad happens, and the fairy tale is a warning story. Like, don't do this.
Yeah.
Because...
But it's much more interactive with Guillermo.
And it's not that simple. And, so this is something that I think kind of ties in with his ideas of morality, too, or at least... So he grew up Catholic. And... He's
not anymore.
Yeah, no, and has very negative feelings about the Catholic Church at this point in his life. And that was one of the things that he sort of was pointing to in... So this is an article called 14 Amazing Facts from, Pan's Labyrinth or something from Mental Floss. I don't have the exact title. But the film, as it sort of reflects Del Toro's negative feelings towards the Catholic Church, it says... Del Toro told an interviewer that he was appalled by the Catholic Church's complicity with fascism during the Spanish Civil War. He said the priest's comment at the banquet table regarding the dead rebels, quote, God has already saved their souls. What happens to their bodies, well, it hardly matters to him. That's a scene in the film, I should say.
Yeah.
Was taken from a real speech that a priest used to give to rebel prisoners in the fascist camps.
Yikes.
And so... This film is sort of an act of disobedience against the Catholic Church, which was sort of a specter over his childhood and early adult life. And we'll get into, I guess this is, what's the big thing we want to talk about with Pan's Labyrinth? For me, it's the Pale Man.
Yeah, I want to talk about Pale Man. I want to talk about Vidal a little bit.
And I think this sort of leads into that. Because, so one of the big set pieces in this film is Ophelia is nearing the end of her quest, and she needs to go and get this artifact, and the book says, take this chalk, you're gonna draw a hole in the wall, it'll turn into a door, you have a certain amount of time to go through the door, and she enters the lair of this Pale Man, which, we saw at the Mia.
Yes. Oh,
during the
my gosh.
Home with Monsters exhibit. It's terrifying. It's huge. It's 6 feet tall.
It's massive.
And it's... this red sort of burning room, and there's this huge long banquet table filled with, it's the typical sort of fairy tale thing, all kinds of fancy food, and the Pale Man is sitting at the end, and it's this figure whose skin is stretched out and flopping because it's emaciated because it's not eating in spite of the food in front of it, and you see there's mosaics, and what it really likes to eat is children. Yeah. Because that's what it is. And so here, she gets the artifact, and there's this big chase scene because, oops, she eats some fruit, and then it wakes up. Yes. And I can't tell, the creature work in this movie is incredible.
Was that his original design? I thought
so.
That was from his notebook with the whole eyeballs in the hands thing, and the way that, the incredible way, of course, Doug Jones, again, doing the big hand thing where he opens his hands and the eyes are in there, and that's the way he looks at her.
Yeah. Which is, and Doug Jones who also plays the Fawn here, which I have an interview. I have some notes from an interview with him about this movie that I kind of want to share in a minute.
It'd be nice to hear Doug Jones' voice because we do talk about just Guillermo, which is great, but it's nice to hear because Doug plays such a huge part in all of his films.
He's such a collaborator. The Shape of Water was his 6th movie with Guillermo, which is insane. In any case, for one of the interpretations of this Pale Man, circling back, as Del Toro says, the Pale Man represents the church for me. He represents fascism and the church eating the children when they have a perversely abundant banquet in front of them. And it's, in modern day, that illusion is even more weighted with, Catholic Church things that have been in the news. So, the Pale Man scene. Yeah, there's a lot. Circling back to this disobedient fairy tale film, this is kind of where that idea of the multiplicity of having all these different fairy tales come in sort of complicates the story he's telling.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's several figures in mythology that eat children.
Yeah.
I mean, Krampus, you know, German mythology.
He didn't necessarily always eat children, though. It's more torture than anything else.
You know, just, you're right. I mean, torture children.
But it's still going after children, and that there's a lot of demons and things that do that.
Yeah. I was being a little facetious. It's fine. And then Kronos, you know, from Greek mythology.
Oh, yeah.
The Titan who I think eats his children. There's that horrifying painting.
Absolutely.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
I certainly do. Yes, I do, and it terrifies me, and it creeps me out.
And also, so, I don't know if we made this clear enough, because we mentioned that it parallels, but so this banquet scene that takes place with Vidal and his officers is directly mirrored here, and the Pale Man is sitting where Vidal is.
And I kind of didn't see that. Maybe it's, it seemed a little too obvious to me, or something. Maybe I just kind of missed it. Yeah.
So, multiplicity of meaning is something that's really huge in this film. Was there anything you kind of wanted to mention about the Pale Man while we're here?
I seem to remember, and I don't have a source for this, but I remember in my, travels, watching Guillermo interviews, I feel like he actually said explicitly that the Pale Man was about, it was a representation of white men specifically.
Well, yeah.
It seems to be kind of an obvious thing, but there was a way that he phrased it, and I cannot remember the quotation, but.
The Pale Man is just such a great symbol for all of these oppressive patriarchal structures. The church, white men in terms of colonialism, all that stuff, fascism. The scene also made Stephen King squirm, allegedly.
Oh, really?
He was at a screening of this with the director, and Guillermo said that, during that scene, he could just, see him, flinching, I don't like it.
Yeah. It was a lot of things that happen in Guillermo films. I seem to remember with other films, too. I'll be sitting there, and a lot of times when gross things come on the screen, I will hide my eyes. There's something about some of Guillermo's movies, there's certain scenes, especially the Pale Man scene, where I want to look away, and I can't look away. Even when he's eating the fairies.
Right.
He's eating, popping their heads off, basically. It's just terrifying. And yet I'm still pretty much watching it without turning away. The things I do turn away from are that time that, Vidal, beats that rebel with a bottle. Yeah. Side note, which is very important. So there are so many films where you see someone being smashed over the head by a beer bottle in a bar. And the beer bottle, smashes and the person is either knocked out or just sort of momentarily stunned. That is not realistic. And I had that illusion broken for me by my best friend who is in film studies. Hi, hun, if you're watching or listening, I should say. And she told me that they actually make bottles for films to break over people's heads that will just smash and disintegrate. And I was so annoyed when she told me this, not with her, but the fact that I had the wool pulled over my eyes all these years with watching films. I went outside, got a beer bottle from our recycling bin, and smashed it on the concrete, and I could not break it. So you could basically smash someone's head in with a bottle instead of actually breaking it over their head like you see in films. And sure enough, this is what Guillermo does purposely in this film. He has that scene where Vidal takes a bottle and smashes it over this guy's head. But the bottle doesn't break; it breaks the guy's skull. Mm-hmm. Very important scene,
and it's a scene from Guillermo del Toro's life too. He had a friend.
Oh, that's right.
He got in a fight with his friend. This is also in that 14 Fun Facts article or whatever.
Yeah,
and the bottle didn't break, and it was just something that stuck with him. And so it's an important thing to have. And like we said, GDT films are always very violent.
Yeah,
but it's intentional. And one of the things that he said, which, he says, everything he says is poetic.
Yeah, pretty much.
But what he said is what he wants to do with Pan's Labyrinth and sort of his films is make the audience susceptible to fantasy. Mm-hmm. Because once you're in the fantasy, it makes the violence all that more horrifying.
Yeah.
And it makes in a weird way, it makes it more realistic because of that. Because
Mission
that's what your
accomplished.
reaction should be.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be just,
Mission
there's a
accomplished.
body going through a window and it's like it's nothing. Captain America's off to
Yeah.
the next fight. Like, you should feel something.
I think, and the scene with the bottle, too, was really important because it shows how brutality doesn't have to exist, in the context of, someone has a gun or someone has a sword. Someone can use anything to harm someone else, and that's also represented in the way that Mercedes, another character in the film, who's I think she's a housekeeper, I think for Vidal, and she's also a rebel, and she and her brother are rebels, and at one point she fears that her brother is dead and he comes back. But anyway, at one point, I forgot exactly the context of this, but she stabs Vidal, and she also cuts open his face.
Oh,
and it's really, really, really hard to watch. It's very, very gross. But it shows kind of the power that people have to harm each other with seemingly mundane things. It's like a small knife. It's not like some, gun or machine gun or war machine. It's something that's small. Eventually, later, he does sew up his face, which is also kind of cool. But anyway, I thought that these kind of smaller acts of very brutal violence are something that he uses in his films. I think they add a certain kind of visceral quality that you said it's not senseless. It's not just, oh, look, there's somebody falling out a window. This is something that's very intentional in a small way, but still remaining terribly brutal.
Yeah, everything is intentional. So I kind of also want to talk about the other big creature in the film, the Fawn.
Yeah, so cool.
The Fawn, also brought to life by Doug Jones. And I guess that might be a weird segue from the violence, but the Fawn is not it's not really a violent character.
No, not really.
No, it's the servant of the king and queen of the underworld, which, I don't know if I just told this to you before I said this while we've been rolling. Guillermo del Toro absolutely believes that Ophelia has her happily ever after. Like, it's real to him.
Yeah.
Which is hopeful for me because, man, like, it's really depressing if you read it as otherwise. Like, it was just in her head or whatever. Yeah. But so, this video called Beauty and the Beast, Doug Jones on Pan's Labyrinth, so interesting.
How long is that?
It was only like 20 minutes. It's on YouTube. Okay. You can find it.
Definitely going to watch that later.
Yes. So what he says about Guillermo del Toro is that he likes to see the monsters as the romantic leads of the story. And that's all hilarious because this is before The Shape of Water.
Yes.
And he first met Guillermo del Toro on a film called Mimic that he had to do just like some last minute.
I was reading about that the other day. It's about basically giant cockroaches that can sort of mimic human beings. It's really gross. Yeah. And Guillermo was unhappy with that film, but I'm guessing that Doug must have played one of the giant cockroach people.
Yeah. And so he gave him his card, and 5 years later was called for Hellboy. But for this movie, he said that Guillermo del Toro called him and was like, Doug, you have to do it. And he does this, he mimics, funny enough, Guillermo del Toro's accent with these emails. And so he originally wasn't sure about wanting to do it because he's like, I don't know Spanish. I can't speak Spanish. Why? Like, he's the only American actor on the film. And he said he read the script and immediately was like, I have to do it. And so he spent months trying to learn the Spanish so he could do it.
That's
amazing. He didn't want it. He's like, I don't want to just be saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever to the child actress. Yeah. And so his voice was eventually dubbed over by an actual Spanish actor.
Yeah, because I was going to say it doesn't sound like him.
No. Okay. And so he said at his first meeting with Guillermo, there were 2 things that he walked away with. The first is that the Fawn is aging backwards in the film. So at the beginning, when you first meet, it's very sort of crickety, and then his hair gets redder at the end. And by the end, when they're in the underworld, he's like in the prime of his existence. I
swear to gosh, I didn't even notice that.
I know. I didn't notice it either, but now you look at it and you can see it. And the second was that Guillermo said, I want you to look at the hooves of barn animals and incorporate that movement into the Fawn.
Here's your homework for tonight, Doug. Look into the hoof movements of animals.
Yeah, well, like, flies are circling, the shake, that sort of thing.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And so he was 7 feet tall, and he was on stilts, and his feet were at such a sharp angle that he said for months he just practiced walking around on the balls of his feet because that's how he had to just sort of, he had to operate it, and he didn't want to be, like, not that you can walk normally in stilts that look like goat hooves or whatever,
Yeah.
but then they just green screened his legs out, which is so cool.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And for him, he saw that the pale man was kind of an extension of the fawn because it's a test.
Oh, and so, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so...
Very grotesque version, but yeah, okay.
And what he said is on the day when he showed up, he just sort of did, like, this crazy run in the costume because he thought, like, Guillermo wanted him to just be, like, this rushing zombie. He's like, no, think of, like, Night of the Living Dead sort of zombie walk. And so he's like, that's the only time we've ever had, like, a conflict about something. And then, it worked really beautifully in the film. Yeah. Speaking of the fawn, one of the interesting things on this 14 notes article is originally the plot was about a married pregnant woman who meets the fawn, falls in love with him, and lets him sacrifice her baby on faith that she, the baby, and the fawn will all be together in the afterlife and the labyrinth will thrive again.
I definitely like this version better.
I like this version, but I also want to see that. That sounds interesting.
That sounds cool.
And I love the fawn. Like, the fawn is so beautiful to look at. Mm-hmm. And the fawn was another one of the creatures that was at the At Home with Monsters exhibit.
That was really stunning. And you can see all the detail that you might miss in the film. I think a lot of times with Guillermo's films, the detail is so rich and so it's wall-to-wall detail that you'd have to watch a movie like 20 times to get it all. Mm-hmm. And to see that in the exhibit up close and personal was really exciting because you could see all the detail that goes into the fawn and how that was so intricately put together.
Mm-hmm. No, it's absolutely incredible. And then jumping back kind of to this Guillermo del Toro interview that we've been talking about, what he really wanted in talking about this idea as the story is a fairy tale, because this particular interview was kind of years after it happened and, people are still talking about it. He wanted the story to feel eternal. Bless you. Like it's one that's been retold for the ages. And I think he really accomplishes that with this movie, because the archetypes that he plays with, granted, he's getting meaning from so many places. Yeah. Like, her red shoes at the end are very clearly sort of a nod to The Wizard of Oz and to the Red Shoes, the film The Red Shoes.
Yeah. Ooh. That's a tough film.
Yeah, I haven't seen that.
You got to.
I feel like we need to put it on the list. Yep. Anyways, but even now, we're 13 years removed, and it still feels like it could have been made yesterday. Mm-hmm. In terms of not only how well it holds up effects-wise, but the story itself. Granted, it's set in a very specific period of time, but that doesn't prevent us from extrapolating into modern.
The film ages very, very well. And I kind of, as I was watching it today, I didn't look at the year. And I kind of had the illusion in my head that it had only happened maybe 5 years ago. And then we looked at the trailer tonight really quick, and it says 2006. I cannot believe that 13 years have gone since that film came out. It looks like it was made yesterday. Mm-hmm. It is just beautifully shot and timeless and seamless too. I mean, you look at this film and there's really nothing that you can sort of take out of it. No. Nothing is non-essential. Even things that are considered like, maybe artsy or maybe prolonged, and like her time in the forest and those kind of things. Like, everything is really important. And yeah, it ages so well. I was surprised.
Yeah. And it's such a feminine film too. I mean, he made this sort of as one in a series, or it's envisioned to be the second film in a series that started with The Devil's Backbone. Oh. I think. Like, this is kind of a companion piece to that. Yeah. In a weird way. Because they're taking place roughly around the same time, within a few years of each other. Okay. And unlike The Devil's Backbone, which has, bombs and ghosts, like this, intentionally, there's a lot of birthing imagery in it, is what he said. The fawn's horns have sort of like the appearance of fallopian tubes. And there's like that fallopian tube, I don't know what that is.
It's an attitude around fallopian tubes.
Around your phallopes.
Wow.
I don't know what that means. It's been a long week. But that was something he said specifically, childbirth and like placenta imagery. And
I was getting that vibe a little bit.
And even like the tree, like the magic tree has sort of that fallopian tube thing. The entrance to the labyrinth does. Yeah. And her mother's pregnant the whole time. And at the end, the colors too, with the gold and the red is sort of kind of like she's not necessarily in utero again, but it's a rebirth, and it's like the warm, safe place.
It's almost like the underworld is like a womb or something.
It is, yeah. And she's born into it. Mm-hmm. And everything else, I mean, it's blue. Like, he loves his blues. I know Guillermo del Toro says, and I do believe that the colors have different meanings in his films, but man, does he love his blue tones. He
really does love his blue tones. I mean, especially, I love the night shots, because, I mean, unfortunately, they're at some of the most horrible points in the film surrounding violence and stuff that happens between the Francoists and the fascists, and then the rebels. But the night shots are really great because he uses those blue tones in such a subtle way.
Mm-hmm. He really does. And also, all of the major sets they worked on were built specifically for the movie. And so this film, even though there are some shots in a wood or whatever like that, when they had to be on location, everything else was built. And so you get that sort of cohesive aesthetic and blurring of the real and the unreal that just is such a staple of what he does. And yeah, I mean, I don't think there are enough good things I can say about this movie.
Yeah.
The violence can be a little more off-putting, but then again, I was never someone who knew a lot about the Spanish Civil War. I still don't. What I know about it...
I don't pretend to know anything about it.
No, what I would know about it is what I would get from his movies in terms of mood and things like that.
And they're very well informed, and they're very, there's a personal connection, I think, for him. So I trust Guillermo to bring that to screen in a realistic way, in a thoughtful way. I think other filmmakers I might not so much, and I'd rather do research on it. But I think Guillermo frames it in such a way that it's sort of digestible, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean... And like we sort of said at the beginning, this is one of it is for sure in my top 50 favorite films. Because it is so well done, because everything is so beautiful. But yeah, it's not an easy film. Like we said, not an easy film by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot that goes into it, and a lot that's really great, and. Yeah, it does feel like a cultural experience when you're watching it, because it is.
Absolutely. It's not simply, this is just,
a fairy tale.
Filmed in Spanish, or it's just a cultural, like, the culture in a lot of foreign language films maybe doesn't necessarily feel like you're being a part of the culture, or like immersing yourself in that. It feels like it's just sort of the backdrop, whereas Guillermo, I feel like he actually uses it in a very thoughtful way, more than a lot of other filmmakers do.
Absolutely.
I was going to ask you, too, one thing. This is kind of a total detour, but I was thinking about the fairies and the imagery around flight in this film, and I know the insects were a part of the exhibit to a certain degree.
Yes.
And I love that aesthetic, and he always brings insects into his work in some way, shape, or form. A lot of the insects were they were framed in the exhibit, but the one in this film was kind of interesting because it has that kind of insect creepiness where you hear this like a weird skittering noise, and that can be very jarring and creepy, but it brings her a certain amount of comfort in the film.
Because she knows her fairies are there. Because the insects look sort of like walking sticks, but they're actually fairies in disguise.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool. No, I mean, was there more of a question to that, or just kind of what
what do you interpret from that? Because I was kind of wondering what the purpose was. I mean, I tend to associate fairies or insects like that bring messages maybe with a certain amount of like freedom or spirit or something. Yeah. And I don't know what he's trying to say with that specifically. Did you find anything in your research?
I didn't find anything about the fairies, no. To me, they sort of serve as like a pagan guardian angel sort of figure type.
Yeah.
Because they are there for her to make sure she does what she needs to do. And like you said, they provide her that sort of comfort, which I think imaginary friends can provide to children. But also, like, they're very real. And they're really her only sense of having someone look out for her constantly. Because even the fawn is a bit mercurial.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. He's sort of leading her down paths that she doesn't necessarily agree with.
Or fully understand.
Or fully understand. And it's definitely, there's like you said, kind of a pagan version of a guardian angel thing going on, which I think was very important.
I agree completely.
Cool.
Was there anything else you kind of wanted to touch on with this film? I mean...
No, I think we covered the main parts that I was interested in.
I mean, for me, it's the creatures, 100%. The creatures and you know, this is one of those movies where it's hard to kind of talk about the intricacies of the plot and the themes beyond just sort of the mythological stuff, because I really don't know anything about the Spanish Civil War or Spanish history, and couldn't even try to be like, this is how this lines up. Like, for me, watching this film, it makes me want to know more about that stuff, and it's something I want to read about. But also, I mean, I'm a sucker for fairy tales.
Yeah.
I'm a bitch for gothic literature. You know what I'm saying?
And so is Guillermo.
He's my soulmate. I swear he's my soulmate. Frankenstein and Jane Eyre, his 2 favorite books, and those are mine.
Yeah, I love his approach to fairy tales. Like as we talked about in the beginning, his mix of imagery and subverting that kind of norm as we expect from fairy tales. Like he doesn't do like cutesy fairies. He does slightly creepy fairies or insect-like fairies.
But just
even the monsters are truly
they're beautiful,
monstrous. Well, Pale Man, I was going to say, is like very, very perverted, but yet the fawn is a little bit more aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with the exception, I think, of the Pale Man, although, like, in the terms of the artistic direction, there's a beauty in how specific it is. But I think with a lot of his monsters, there is the beauty to be found, because for him, the monsters are the ones, most of the time, we should sympathize with. Clearly not the Pale Man.
Yes.
But, in his other works, like Hellboy, Shape of Water.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
For sure.
I think another kind of important point to make about the difference between the Pale Man and the Fawn is that the Fawn has a speaking role. There's a lot of characterization, but if you look at the Pale Man in terms of him being a monster, it's definitely the Pale Man is a perversion of man, whereas the Fawn is a little bit more creature-like.
Yes, I agree.
And
completely.
Because the Pale Man doesn't really have words, and is a sort of blank space in a weird sort of way, that's more of a representation of evil. Whereas the Fawn is much more traditionally Guillermo-esque, because it kind of is a good character, but it also kind of he kind of has some sort of bad points, you could say. Because he's asking, he's a trickster, and he's asking her to maybe do things that she might not be comfortable with.
Right. I mean, I see the Fawn as sort of like the closest parallel would be like a Hermes.
Yeah.
Still a god. One of the lesser gods, in quotation marks, still a god, so still subject to whims, but ultimately there for her good. Whereas the Pale Man feels a lot to me like Lucifer in Dante's Inferno. A monster who is stuck in a hell of its own making.
Yeah, yeah.
If you're familiar with those texts, there you go. You could, if you write a paper about that topic, I want some kind of credit in that. So, I mean, in terms of rating this movie, because I think that's where we're at.
Yeah.
For me, this is a 10 out of 10 for me. Easy. 10 fawns out of 10.
Yeah. I'm going to do my kind of binary rating system. This film is a clear 10. Without question. Personally speaking, I think because it kind of, for some reason I can't maybe connect with it in the same way you do, I would maybe give it like a 9.5 out of 10, just because it's something is missing for me personally. Like, a lot of films that I watch, and I've reached 800 films now. There are a lot of films that I would give, full credit, full rating to, but maybe not enjoy as well. And this is one of those films.
Same for me. I mean, I think there's others I would watch definitely before this, just because it is so dark. But I don't think you can deny just the skill.
Yeah, you can't. You can't really. I mean, I don't really remember reading or hearing about any negative reviews of this at all.
I don't think there were.
Yeah,
like it's a critical darling.
Yeah, I think so.
For sure.
And I think for filmmaking too is it was quite an inspiration for people, as all Guillermo films are. But there's something about this Devil's Backbone is creative and beautiful. I haven't seen the whole thing obviously, but. Right. That one is not the same as this, because this is partially a fairy tale. There's a lot of creativity that goes into this, and I think that that's what sets Guillermo apart from other filmmakers. Is he does stuff that's a little bit less challenging visually or artistically in terms of, he's setting something in a particular time period, whereas this is a mixture between, it's technically historical because it's taking place in 1944 Spain, but at the same time, his crafting of that parallel world is what is really inspirational to viewers and filmmakers alike.
Absolutely. Well, I mean,
Whew.
It's a bummer of a movie.
Yeah, it's not. It's not something I would suggest for date night.
No, you definitely have to be in a frame of mind where you can take it on because I mean, violence against children is never easy.
Yeah, it's not at all.
So just be careful with yourself if you are someone that's like feeling in a little bit of a fragile state. Like it's not easy to watch, but it's totally worth it.
Mm-hmm. I think it is. If you're in the right mood, this film is really something that you can't you can't get into being a serious film watcher without having watched at least one of Guillermo's works, and that's why we're doing DelTober, I think, because you and I personally and collectively are so inspired by his films, as so many people are.
Yeah. Well,
I think it's time to wrap it up.
I think it's time to wrap it up.
If you encounter a fawn,
let us know.
Let us know, number one, and also take their advice with a giant grain of salt.
Agreed. Until next time.